This is the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1, Lecture 2, and it follows his homework assignment that he gave to Mannoni, Anzieu, and Perrier and Granoff. Lecture 2, Preliminary Comments on the Problem of Resistance. Part 1. Following Mannoni's presentation, we should offer our heartiest thanks to Mannoni, who has given us a most happy prologue to the resumption of the seminar's dialogue. Nonetheless, he has distinctly phenomenological leanings, and I don't think that the solution has quite the form that he leads us to believe, as he himself has sensed. But it is useful to have framed the question as he has, by speaking of an interpersonal mechanism, although the word quote-unquote mechanism can only be an approximation at this juncture. Part 2. Interruption in the course of Anzieu's presentation. Freud explains, apropos of Lucy R., that he had recourse to pressure of the hands when he could only obtain partial hypnosis. Later on, he says that he stopped worrying about this and even renounced seeking an answer from the subject to the question in accordance with the classical method, "Are you asleep?" Since he had had the unpleasant experience of receiving the reply, "No, I am not at all asleep," which put him in a rather embarrassing position. He recounts in a naive and charming manner that he was obliged to tell the subject that he was not talking about quite the same sort of sleep as that to which the other's reply pertained, and that the latter must, nonetheless, have been a little bit asleep. Within the limits of the most perfect ambiguity, he quite clearly states that all this put him in a most embarrassing position, which only came to an end the day he no longer cared one way or the other. But he retained the pressure of hands, either on the forehead or on either side of the head, and at the same time he asked the patient to concentrate upon the cause of the symptom. That was an intermediary stage between dialogue and hypnosis. The symptoms were dealt with one by one, in themselves tackled directly like so many formal problems. In Freud's hands, the patient was assured that the memories which were going to come forth were the most relevant ones, that all he had to do was trust in that. And Freud added the detail that it would be at that moment, when he removed his hands, mimicking the lifting of the barrier, that the patient would be completely aware and would only have to take hold of what came into his mind in order to be certain of being on the right track. It is quite remarkable that this method proved itself perfectly effective for the cases which Freud tells us of. Indeed, the case of Lucy R., which is so elegant, was entirely solved with an effortlessness which has all the beauty of works by primitives. You will find happy chance, a benevolent divine conjunction in everything new that is discovered. In contrast, with Anna O., we find the hard labor of working through. Possessing all the animation and density of the most modern analytic cases, despite the method that was used, the whole series of events, the whole history, is relived and reworked several times. It required work of extended scope, lasting almost a year. In the case of Lucy R., things happen much more quickly, and with an elegance that turns it into something quite striking. Undoubtedly, we aren't truly able to see where the mainsprings lie, on account of it being too compressed. But even so, it is of enormous use. This woman had what one could call olfactory hallucinations, hysterical symptoms, and their signification was detected, with locations and dates, in an altogether happy manner. On this occasion, Freud reveals all the minutiae of his way of working. Part 3. Item. Interruption in the course of D. Anzieu's presentation. I have already emphasized the uniquely privileged character of the cases which Freud dealt with, on account of the special character of his technique. What that was, we can only guess at on the basis of a number of rules which he has given us, and which have been faithfully applied. As the best authors, and those who knew Freud, have admitted, one cannot gain a complete conception of the way in which he applied his technique. I must emphasize the fact that Freud progressed on a course of research which is not characterized by the same style as other scientific research. Its domain is that of the truth of the subject. The quest for truth is not entirely reducible to the objective, an objectifying quest of ordinary scientific mind. What is at stake is the realization of the truth of the subject, like a dimension peculiar to it which must be detached in its distinctiveness, originalité, in relation to the very notion of reality. I have emphasized this in all of this year's lectures. Freud was taken up in the quest for a truth which engaged him totally, including there his own self, and hence also his presence with respect to the patient in his function, let us say, of therapist, even though the term is completely inadequate as a description of his attitude. As Freud himself said, this engagement gave an absolutely unique character to his relations with his patients. To be sure, analysis as a science is always a science of the particular. The coming to fruition of an analysis is always a unique case, even if these unique cases lend themselves all the same to some generality, since there is more than one analyst. But with Freud, the analytic experience represents uniqueness carried to its limits. From the fact that he was in the process of building and verifying analysis itself, we cannot obliterate the fact that it was the first time that an analysis was undertaken. Doubtless, the method is derived from it, but it is only method for other people. Freud, for his part, did not apply a method. If we overlook the unique and inaugural character of his endeavor, we will be committing a serious error. Analysis is an experience of the particular. The very first experience of this particular thus takes on an even more peculiar value. If we do not emphasize the difference between this first time and everything that has followed since, we, who are interested not so much in this truth as in the construction of the access roads to this truth, will never be able to grasp the meaning of certain sentences, certain texts, which come into view in Freud's oeuvre, and subsequently take on, in other contexts, a completely different meaning, even though one might consider them to be stenciled one on top of the other. The interest of these commentaries on the Freudian text allows us to follow out in detail those questions which, as you will see, as you already see today, have a considerable importance. They are numerous and insidious. Strictly speaking, the sort of questions that each and every one of us is careful to avoid, relying instead on a jingle, a formula which is schematic, abbreviated, and vivid. Part 4. Anzieu cites a passage from the Studies on Hysteria, SE 287-9. Interruption. What's striking about the passage that you refer to is that it takes off from the pseudo-anatomical metaphor called to mind whenever Freud talks about verbal images wandering up and down the nerve fibers. Here, what is stratified around the pathogenic nucleus cells to mind a bundle of papers, a score with several registers. These metaphors overpoweringly tend to suggest the materialization of speech, not the mythical materialization of the neurologist, but a concrete materialization. Speech begins to flow in the leaves of a printed manuscript. The metaphor of the blank page, of the palimpsest, is also taken up on another occasion. It has since appeared under the pen of more than one analyst. Here we come upon the idea of several longitudinal strata, that is to say, of several threads of discourse. One may imagine them as rendered material in the text in the form of literally concrete bundles. There is a stream of parallel words, and these broaden out at a certain moment to encompass this famous pathogenic nucleus, which itself is also a story. They move away from it in order to include it and join up a little further on. The phenomenon of resistance is to be located precisely at this point. There are two directions, one longitudinal and one radial. Resistance acts in the radial direction. When one wants to get closer to the threads which lie at the heart of the bundle, it is a result of an attempt to move from the external registers towards the center. From the repressed nucleus, a positive repulsive force is exerted, and when one strives to reach the threads of the discourse which are closest to it, you feel resistance. Freud even goes so far as to write, not in the Studies, but in a later text, published under the title Metapsychologie, that the strength of the resistance is inversely proportional to one's distance from the repressed center. The closer you get, it's more resistant. I am not sure if this is the exact wording, but it is very striking. It makes manifest the materialization of resistance acquired in the course of experience, and precisely, as Mannoni put it just now, in the subject's discourse. In order to know where it is happening, où ça se passe, what the material, biological foundation is, Freud quite straightforwardly takes the discourse to be a reality in its own right, a reality which is there, a sheaf, a bundle of proofs, as one also calls it, a bundle of juxtaposed discourses which overlap, follow on from each other, forming a dimension, a layer, a dossier. The notion of a material support of speech, singled out as such, was not yet available to Freud. Today, he would have taken a succession of phonemes which make up a part of the subject's discourse as the basis for his metaphor. He would say that one encounters greater and greater resistance the closer the subject comes to a discourse which would be the ultimate one, the right one, but one which he absolutely refuses. In the attempt at synthesis that you are making, what has not perhaps been highlighted is the question, which however is in the foreground, where resistance is concerned. The question concerning the relations of the unconscious and the conscious. Is resistance a phenomenon which occurs only in analysis? Or is it something we can talk about when the subject goes about his business outside of analysis, and even before he enters it, or after he has left it? Does resistance continue to have a meaning outside of analysis? There is a discussion of resistance in the analysis of dreams to which neither of you have referred, and which nevertheless constitutes the implicit hypothesis behind some of the problems both of you have raised, since Freud there asked himself about the inaccessible nature of the unconscious. The ideas of resistance are extremely old, and right from the start, from Freud's initial researches, resistance is linked to the idea of the ego. But when one reads some startling sentences in the text of the studies, where it is not just a question of the ego as such, but of the ego as representing the ideational mass, one realizes that the notion of the ego already foreshadows for Freud all the problems that it now presents for us. I would almost say that it is a notion with retroactive effect. It even seems, from reading these early pieces in the light of what has developed since around the ego, that the most recent formulations mask rather than reveal. One cannot but see in this phrase, the ideational mass, something very close to a formula that I could have given you, namely that the countertransference is nothing other than the function of the analyst's ego, what I have called the sum total of the analyst's prejudices. Thus, one discovers in the patient a whole organization of certainties, beliefs, of coordinates, of references, which constitute in the strictest sense what Freud right from the beginning called an ideational system, which we can, in an abbreviated manner, here call the system. Does resistance stem only from that? When, at the limit of this domain of speech, which is exactly the ideational mass of the ego, I portrayed for you the sum of silence after which another speech again makes its appearance, that speech which is to be reconquered in the unconscious, since it is that part of the subject separated from his history. Is that resistance? Is it, yea or nay, purely and simple the ego's organization which, in and of itself, constitutes resistance? Is that what makes it difficult to gain access to the contents of the unconscious in the radial dimension, to use Freud's term? That is a very simple question, too simple, insoluble as such. Fortunately, in the first 30 years of this century, analytic technique made sufficient progress, has been through enough experimental phases to distinguish its own questions. As you see, it boils down to this, which, as I told you, will be the model of our quest. We must assume that the evolution, the ups and downs of the analytic experience teach us something concerning the very nature of this experience, insofar as it is also a human experience masked from itself. That is, applying to analysis itself the schema that it has taught us. After all, isn't it itself a roundabout way of having access to the unconscious? It also raises to the second degree the problem that is set for us by neurosis. I am only making a claim for this now. You'll see it demonstrated as we examine it. What do I want? If not to get out of this genuine impasse, mental and practical, in which analysis has now ended up. You see that I push what I say quite far. It is incumbent on us to submit even analysis to the operational schema that it has taught us, and which consists in reading enough in the different phases of its theoretico-technical development to advance further towards the reconquest of the authentic reality of the unconscious by the subject. This method will require us to go well beyond the simple formal catalog of procedures or of conceptual categories, submitting analysis to an examination which is itself analytic is a step which will reveal its fertility in relation to technique, as fertile as it had already revealed itself in relation to Freud's clinical writings. Part 5. Interventions in the course of the discussion. Psychoanalytic writings swarm with improprieties of method. These are difficult themes to deal with, to verbalize, without giving the verb a subject. In addition, we are always reading that the ego emits the signal of anxiety, handles the life extinct, death extinct. One no longer knows where the switchboard, the signalman, the pointer is. All of this is quite improper. We are continually finding Maxwell's little demons making an appearance in analytic writing, possessing foresight, intelligence. The annoying thing is that analysts do not have a clear idea of the nature of these demons. We're here to discover what the evocation of the notion of the ego means from one end to the other of Freud's work. It's impossible to understand what this notion represents as it began to emerge with the work of the 1920s, with the studies on the psychology of groups and das Ich und das Es. If one starts by drowning everything in a sum total, under the pretext that what is involved is the apprehension of a certain aspect of the psyche, that's not at all what the ego is in Freud's work. It has a functional role, linked to technical necessities. The triumvirate who work in New York, Hartmann, Loewenstein, and Kreis, in its current attempt to elaborate a psychology of the ego, is always asking itself, what was Freud trying to get at in his last theory of the ego? Has anyone up to now really drawn out all the technical implications from it? I am not interpreting, I am only repeating what can be found in Hartmann's 2 or 3 most recent articles. In the Psychoanalytic Quarterly for 1951, you'll find 3 articles by Loewenstein, Kreis, and Hartmann on this topic, which are worth reading. It can't be said that they lead to a fully satisfying formulation, but they are looking in that direction and propose theoretical principles which have very important technical applications, which according to them have not been noticed. It is very interesting to follow the development of this work in a series of articles we have seen appear over several years, especially since the end of the war. I believe that what has happened there is a very significant failure, one which has to be very instructive for us. In any case, there is a world of difference between the ego, as discussed in the studies, the ideational mass, container of ideations, and the final theory of the ego, such as that had been wrought by Freud himself from 1920 on, which is still a problem for us. Between the two lies the central field we are in the process of studying. How did this final theory of the ego get to see the light of day? It is the apex of Freud's theoretical elaboration, an extremely original and novel theory. Yet, under Hartmann's pen, it seems as if it strove with all its might to merge once again with classical psychology. Both of these things are true. This theory, Chris brings psychoanalysis within general psychology, and at the same time constitutes an unprecedented innovation. A paradox that we will highlight here, whether we carry on with the technical papers up to the holidays or tackle the same problem in Schreber's writings. In Bergman's article, Germinal Cell, the germinal cell of analytic observations is taken to be the notion of a rediscovery and restitution of the past. He refers to the Studien über Hysterie in order to show how, right up to the end of his work, right up to the final expressions of his thought, Freud always kept this notion of the past in the foreground. In 1,000 forms, and above all in the form of reconstruction. In this article, the experience of resistance is therefore in no way considered as central. M. Hyppolite is alluding to the fact that Freud's anatomical researches can be viewed as successes and have been recognized as such. In contrast, when he set himself to work at the physiological level, he seems to have shown a certain lack of interest. That is one of the reasons why he didn't recognize the importance of the discovery of cocaine. His physiological research was feeble because it stuck fast to the therapeutics. Freud concerned himself with the use of cocaine as an analgesic, and left to one side its anesthetic value. Here we are reminding ourselves of a trait of Freud's personality. Certainly, we can ask ourselves if he was, as Z was saying, keeping himself for a more glorious destiny. But to go so far as to say that turning towards psychopathology was for him a compensation is, I believe, a bit excessive. If one reads the works published under the title The Origins of Psychoanalysis and the rediscovered early manuscript in which a theory of the psychic apparatus figures, one realizes that he was following the line of contemporary theoretical elaboration of the mechanistic functioning of the nervous apparatus. Besides, everyone recognized it. One shouldn't really be surprised, therefore, that electrical metaphors are mixed up in it. But nor should you forget that the electric current was experimented with for the first time in the area of nerve conduction, without anyone knowing what the implications would be. Fair. This appears to be like a series of dialogue kind of writing. Z. I believe that, from the clinical point of view, the notion of resistance clearly represents an experience that we all encounter at some time or another with almost all the patients in our practices. He is resisting, and it makes me furious. Sorry, what's that? Z. I mean that extremely unpleasant experience when you say to yourself, he was on the point of discovering. He could have discovered himself. He knows it without knowing that he knows it. All he has to do is take the trouble to look up, and this damn idiot, this cretin, all those aggressive and hostile words that leap to mind, doesn't do it. And the temptation that one feels to push him, to compel him. Don't get too excited about it. M. Hyppolite. The only thing that allows the analyst to be intelligent is when this resistance makes the analysand look like an idiot. It promotes heightened self-esteem. All the same, the trap of countertransference, since we have to call it that, is more insidious than the first plane. Z. For direct power over human beings, Freud substitutes the indirect and more palatable power that science gives over nature. We see here again the mechanism of intellectualization, understand nature, and by that very fact subdue her to oneself, the classical formula of determinism, which elusively refers back to Freud's authoritarian character, which punctuates the whole of his history, particularly in his relations with heretics as much as with his disciples. I ought to say that if I do speak in this manner, I stop short of making it the key to the Freudian discovery. Z. I don't think I'm making it the key either, but it is an interesting point to highlight. In this resistance, Freud's hypersensitivity to the subject's resistance is not unconnected to his own character. What allows you to speak of Freud's hypersensitivity? Z. The fact that he, and not Brewer, not Charcot, nor anyone else, discovered it. After all, it happened to him, because he felt it more keenly, and he accounted for what he had experienced. You believe that the fact of bringing out a function like resistance indicates a specific intolerance in the subject to whatever resists him? Isn't it, on the contrary, knowing how to conquer it, how to go elsewhere and well beyond, which allowed Freud to turn it into one of the mainsprings of the therapy, a factor which one can render objective, nameable, and manageable? You think that Freud is more authoritarian than Charcot? Whereas Freud, insofar as he could, renounced suggestion so as to let the subject integrate what the resistances separated him from. In other words, are those who fail to recognize méconnaissance resistance less authoritarian, or is it the person who recognizes it for what it is? I am rather inclined to believe that someone who in hypnotism attempts to make an object of the subject his thing, to make him as supple as a glove, so as to give him any form that he chooses, so as to take from him what he wants, is, more so than Freud, driven by a need to dominate and exercise his power. In contrast, Freud seems respectful of what is generally known as the object's resistance. Z. Certainly. I believe that one must be extremely careful here. We cannot make use of our technique so importunately. When I talk about analyzing Freud's work, it's so as to venture into it with unqualified analytic prudence. One shouldn't make a character trait into a constant of the personality. Agreed. Still less a characteristic of the subject. On this topic, you'll find some very hasty things from Jones' pen, but things which are nonetheless more subtly put than what you have said. To think that Freud's career was a compensation for his desire for power, even for his clear-cut megalomania, of which, moreover, one may find traces in remarks he made, I think that's Freud's drama. From the moment when he discovers his path, cannot be summarized like that. We have, after all, learned enough through analysis not to feel ourselves obliged to identify the Freud who dreams of world domination with the Freud who reveals a new truth. It doesn't seem to me to arise out of the same cupido, if not of the same libido. M. Hyppolite. Even so, it seems to me, without accepting in their totality the formulations of Z and the conclusions he draws from them, that in Charcot's domination through hypnosis, it was only a matter of domination over someone reduced to an object, of the possession of a being no longer master of himself. Whereas, in the Freudian domination, it is the vanquishing of a subject, a being who still has self-awareness. Hence, there is a stronger will for domination in the domination of the resistance to be conquered than in the simple and straightforward suppression of this resistance, without being able to draw from the conclusion that Freud wanted to dominate the world. Is domination really what is at stake in Freud's experience? I always have reservations about lots of things which aren't specified in his way of going about things. His interventionism, in particular, I find surprising if we compare it to some of the technical principles to which we now grant importance. But you'll find in this interventionism no satisfaction being gained from having won a victory. But you'll find in this interventionism no satisfaction being gained from having won a victory over the patient's consciousness, in contradiction to what Hyppolite says, less, certainly, than in the modern techniques which put all the emphasis on the resistances. In Freud, we find a more nuanced attitude. That is to say, more humane. He doesn't always define what is now called interpretation of defense, which is not, perhaps, the best way of putting it. But when all is said and done, interpretation of contents has for Freud the role of interpretation of defense. You're right to allude to this, Z. That is because that's for you. I will try and show you in what way the danger of a forcing of the subject to the analyst's intervention emerges. It's much more out in the open in so-called modern techniques. As one says, in talking about analysis the way one talks about chess than it ever was in Freud. And I don't believe that the theoretical promulgation of the notion of resistance can be used as a pretext for making this accusation against Freud. An accusation which goes radically against the liberating effect of his work and of his therapeutic activity. I am not putting your opinions on trial, Z, for this is well and truly your opinion. Certainly, one should show a spirit of scrutiny, of criticism, with respect to the founding works, but in this form, it can only serve to increase the mystery, and not at all to throw light on it. 20th and 27th January, 1954.